6 years ago, a black family moved into the neighborhood, cheerfully bringing fresh, juicy oranges to their white neighbor, Wallace Trowbridge.
Hello? Is anybody home?
What is it? What do you want?
Hi, Mr. Trowbridge.
We just picked some fresh oranges. Thought you might like some.
I don't take handouts from strangers. And keep the noise down over there.
However, he was a racist. Today, the family is holding a secret wedding. Upon hearing the commotion from next door,
Making a racket again? Do they think they live in a slum?
the man immediately dialed 911 to call the police.
Let's see how much longer you'll be smiling. Shut this down right now! Nobody move!
A cop approached the black family's house.
I need to see everyone's ID. Who's in charge of this mess? Officer, this is a private wedding. You have no warrant. You're resisting. You're under arrest.
I got it. Keep rolling. Don't stop.
You just unlawfully detained a compliant citizen. Release him!
Back off, lady, or you're going in cuffs too.
Wallace Trowbridge, a 55-year-old white man, stood close to the edge of the wooden fence, crushing an empty beer can in his hand. Ever since he moved into this quiet neighborhood 8 years ago, the presence of the black family next door had been a constant thorn in his side. He peered through the narrow gaps, his eyes bloodshot with glaring streaks of envy and resentment. Across the fence, a violin played a soothing chamber piece. About 80 elegantly dressed guests sat neatly in rows of pristine white chairs. At the altar, Gideon Mercer, 42, stood waiting solemnly. Clad in his military dress uniform, with a row of medals gleaming on his chest, the black colonel exuded the rugged, calm demeanor of a man seasoned by the harsh winds of the battlefield. No shouting, no chaos. Only the October afternoon sunlight stretching across the perfectly manicured green lawn of the Hastings estate. That peace, that success, and that order made Wallace sick to his stomach. He could not stand the sight of black people hosting such a magnificent and proud celebration right next to his home. Pulling his phone from his pocket, Wallace's thick fingers punched in 3 numbers. 911? What is your emergency? Wallace took a deep breath, intentionally making his voice tremble and rush. Send someone to 442 Oak Street immediately. It's a riot. Dozens of black thugs are gathering, tearing up the whole neighborhood. Their cars are blocking the fire lanes. There are a few guys loitering around my property line, looking extremely suspicious. I'm not sure, but I think they're armed. Are you in a safe location, sir? We will dispatch the nearest patrol units. Hurry up before they destroy this whole block. Wallace cut her off and hung up. He stepped back into the shadows of his porch, crossed his arms, and smirked, waiting for the charade to be ruined. Don't forget to hit the like button on this video to spread this powerful message to more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on the dramatic, meaningful, and deeply emotional stories in our upcoming videos. On the second floor of 442, completely detached from the filthy schemes outside, 38-year-old Zoraida Hastings stood in front of the mirror. There was no rush of a bride about to walk down the aisle, no nervous sniffling. Zoraida smoothed the crease on the sleeve of her ivory silk gown herself. Every movement she made was deliberate, precise, and calculated. At 38, Zoraida's demeanor had been forged by an ironclad discipline and the sharpness of a woman accustomed to weighing the scales of justice. On the oak desk next to her bed, a leather-bound folder lay open. Inside were stacks of legal documents littered with red ink notes, rulings, and testimonies awaiting a verdict. Zoraida glanced over the text one last time. She reached out, snapped the folder shut, placed it in a drawer, and turned the key. The click echoed dryly. Today, the cloak of authority would be locked away. In place of the folder, Zoraida set down a silver-framed photograph. The woman in the picture had dark, deep eyes and a gentle smile. Her mother. Zoraida rested her fingertips on the cold glass. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to memorize this moment. A soft knock on the door. Solomon Hastings, her father, who had just turned 70, slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. Though his hair was entirely white, Solomon still maintained the upright posture of a man who had carried his family through many turbulent times. He wore a custom-tailored Navy suit, a white rosebud pinned to his lapel. When he saw his daughter, his footsteps halted. Zoraida. Solomon's voice trembled slightly, trying to swallow the emotion swelling in his throat. I bet if your mother were here, she wouldn't let it be this quiet. She would be crying her eyes out. But Mom would make you fix her makeup for her. Zoraida gave a soft smile and stepped forward. Solomon reached out and touched his daughter's veil. His gaze drifted out the window, taking in the land his father had bought with 31 years of postal wages. The only piece of land on this street belonging to a black family, standing firm through 6 decades. Is everything ready, Dad? Zoraida asked, breaking his train of thought. Gideon is waiting for you. The boy is 42, has faced life and death more times than I can count, yet he's standing there as stiff as if he's about to receive orders for combat. Solomon chuckled softly, extending his arm. Let's go, sweetheart. Zoraida took her father's arm. The coldness on her face softened, giving way to a rare serenity. Together, they walked down the wooden stairs. Down in the yard, everything was playing out like a perfect film. As the deep green front door opened, the string quartet began playing the wedding march. All the guests rose in unison. The space was filled only with the scent of star jasmine and the rustling of oak leaves. Gideon stood at the altar, hands clasped behind his back, his spine perfectly straight. But when his eyes met Zoraida's silhouette stepping out from the porch, his jaw tightened and his chest rose and fell slightly. The colonel, who had never blinked staring down the barrel of a gun, was now struggling to keep his eyes from tearing up. Solomon walked his daughter down the stone-paved path. Rose petals caught beneath their soles. A little girl in a lemon-yellow dress skipped ahead, tossing handfuls of petals into the air with a bright, ringing laugh. Zoraida stepped up to the altar. Solomon placed his daughter's hand in Gideon's, gave it a gentle pat, and stepped back to the front row. "You look beautiful," Gideon whispered, his deep, raspy voice meant only for her. Zoraida squeezed his hand, her smile reaching her eyes. The pastor smiled and opened his Bible. The scene was so sacred that even the most restless children in the back rows watched in hushed silence. The perfection lasted for exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, because on the other side of the fence, Wallace Trowbridge was no longer looking at the wedding. He was looking toward the end of Oak Street. A low, distant wail began to rise. At first, it sounded like wind whistling through the branches. Then it grew louder. Piercing, fierce, the siren of a police cruiser. Zoraida frowned slightly. Gideon lifted his head. The pastor stopped mid-prayer, flashing red and blue lights reflected through the gaps in the wooden fence, sweeping long streaks across the pristine white tablecloths, across the bewildered faces of the 80 guests. 2 patrol cars braked hard, burning rubber right in front of the Hastings estate. The screech of tires grinding against gravel echoed harshly, tearing the unfinished violin melody to shreds. 4 car doors swung open simultaneously. Wallace Trowbridge retreated deep into the shadows, his arms crossed over his chest. A satisfied smile stretched across his face. His play had officially begun. Gideon Mercer took a deep breath. The crisp October air, carrying the sweet scent of star jasmine, filled the veteran's lungs. Before him, Zoraida stood breathtakingly poised and regal in her ivory silk gown, her deep dark eyes locked entirely onto his. "Zoraida?" Gideon's voice rang out, warm and resonant, carrying easily to the 80 guests seated before them. "I have spent half my life taking orders, defending borders in foreign lands. But standing here right now, I finally realize that the only border I want to spend the rest of my life guarding is your peace." Zoraida offered a soft smile. The corners of Gideon's eyes were slightly red, a rare vulnerability that the Army colonel was only willing to expose to the one woman strong enough to hold his heart. The pastor beamed, gently turning to the next page of his Bible. "And you, Zoraida Hastings, the bride's vows never had the chance to be spoken before reality was ripped apart. It began as a low, distant wail echoing from the far end of Oak Street. It wasn't loud at first, but it was enough to crack the sacred stillness of the garden. Then it amplified, sharp and piercing, hurtling toward them with the speed of a razor blade. Flashing red and blue lights swept through the gaps in the wooden fence, casting cold, menacing streaks across the pristine white tablecloths, the crystal glasses, and the stunned faces of the guests. The screech of tires grinding against gravel pierced the air. 2 patrol cars braked hard, violently jerking to a halt right in front of the Hastings Iron Gate. The crackle of police radios bled through the open windows, mixing with the acrid smell of burnt rubber. The engines cut off. 4 car doors swung open with heavy mechanical thuds, the unmistakable sound of an aggressive intervention. The string quartet froze. The violinist's bow slipped, letting out a jarring screech. All 80 guests turned their heads toward the gate. The elderly instinctively shrank back in their seats, a conditioned reflex passed down through generations of Black Americans whenever police lights swept into their spaces. A few mothers hurriedly pulled their playing toddlers into their laps, shielding their eyes. Officer Carver stepped out of the lead cruiser. He was in his early 30s, his hair buzzed short, mirrored sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. His jaw was set hard, his boots stomping against the pavement as though he were arriving at a violent riot rather than a rose-filled garden. Carver's right hand rested menacingly on the grip of the Glock holstered at his hip. He didn't draw the weapon, but the threat was firmly established in every rigid crease of his uniform. From the second car, Officer Delaney emerged. She moved slower, her eyes rapidly scanning the scene. Delaney frowned. What she saw were men in meticulously tailored suits, women in elegant fascinators, a three-tiered cake adorned with white fondant flowers, and a couple standing beneath a wedding arch. It was the complete opposite of the armed black mob dispatch they had just received over the radio. The glaring contradiction made Delaney hesitate, but Carver didn't. He didn't observe, he didn't analyze. Carver kicked the wrought iron gate open and marched straight in with long, aggressive strides. He bypassed the catering tables, completely ignoring the terrified eyes of the children. The heavy heels of his black boots crushed the delicate rose petals the flower girl had just scattered, leaving filthy, muddy footprints on the stone path leading directly to the altar. "Shut it all down!" Carver's voice boomed, gruff, abrasive, and dripping with condescension. His shout shattered the solemnity of the ceremony, striking the ears of 80 people who sat frozen in shock. The pastor took a step back, the Bible trembling in his hands. Gideon's fists clenched, a muscle in his jaw ticking, but his feet remained firmly planted, acting as a human shield half-stepping in front of Zoraida. Behind him, Zoraida didn't flinch. Her eyes, sharp, cold, and calculating, locked onto the approaching officer. She noted the placement of his hand, his aggressive gait, and the hostile tone of his voice. There was no panic in her gaze, only a silent judgment taking shape. Carver stopped barely 6 feet from the altar. He thrust his index finger toward the elderly pastor. "Who's in charge of this mess?" Carver barked, looking Gideon and Zoraida up and down with undisguised contempt. "Officer," Gideon spoke up, his voice deep, steady, and carrying the undeniable authority of a commanding officer. "This is a private wedding ceremony on private property. Your presence is disrupting." "I didn't ask you, soldier," Carver interrupted, deliberately using the word soldier with a mocking sneer, as if the medals on Gideon's chest were cheap costume jewelry. "We got a call about a disturbance of the peace, noise violations, and blocking traffic. Now, who owns this land?" From the front row, Solomon Hastings stood up slowly. At 70, his dignity was unshakable. He smoothed the lapels of his suit, stepped out of the aisle, and approached the officer. "I am the homeowner, officer. My name is Solomon Hastings. This land has been in my family for over 60 years. My daughter is getting married today, and we are not violating any noise or public order ordinances." Carver looked the old man up and down. He didn't see a respected homeowner. He only saw an old black man trying to act above his station. "Where's your permit?" Carver demanded, holding out an expectant hand. Solomon furrowed his brow. "A permit for a private family gathering of under 90 people on residential property? Savannah City law does not require a permit for this. I am very well aware." "I don't care what you're aware of." Carver raised his voice, taking a step forward to use his sheer size as an intimidation tactic. "You people bring a whole pack here, blasting music, dumping your cars all over the street. I know exactly how your gatherings go. You think putting on a nice suit and stringing up some flowers gives you the right to take over the neighborhood?" The phrase "you people" left Carver's mouth without any overt slurs, but the weight of his prejudice was so thick and palpable that everyone in the yard felt it. It was the language of abused power, of bigotry validated by a tin badge. Delaney, who had finally caught up, quickly reached out and lightly touched her partner's elbow. "Carver," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety, "look around. This is clearly a wedding. No weapons, no riot. The dispatch must have been a false report. We need to document our presence and pull out." Carver shoved Delaney's hand away. He didn't even look at her, his eyes still pinned on Solomon and Gideon. His partner's attempt to de-escalate only inflated his ego. To him, backing down now meant showing weakness. It meant letting these black people win on the turf he believed he commanded. "I'm conducting an investigation, Delaney." "Step back," Carver ordered coldly, then pivoted toward the completely silent seated guests. "Listen up." He slapped his hand against the butt of his gun, producing a menacing metallic clack. "Because the homeowner is refusing to cooperate and cannot prove the legality of this gathering, I want everyone here to get their IDs out. Right now, I'm going to check every single one of you to see if you have the legal right to be in this area." A collective murmur of outrage and fear rippled through the crowd. In the third row, an 84-year-old grandmother with trembling hands frantically fumbled with the clasp of her clutch, trying to find her ID card. The young woman beside her quickly wrapped her arms around her grandmother, glaring at the officer with seething anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Gideon stepped down from the altar, physically blocking Carver's path toward the guests. His military bearing erupted, a wall of iron discipline standing tall. "You have no warrant. You have no probable cause. You have no legal right to run identification checks on invited guests who haven't committed a crime. You are obstructing justice," Carver roared, his face flushing crimson. His hand gripped his holster tightly. "Step aside, or I will put you in cuffs for interfering with a law enforcement officer. I am standing on my family's property." Gideon refused to yield a single inch. He didn't raise his voice, but the icy edge in his tone sliced through the tension. "And you are illegally abusing your authority. I want your badge number, and I want your supervising officer down here now." The air was stretched as taut as a snapping wire. 80 people held their breath. The wind died down. The birds stopped singing. The only sound left was the heavy, ragged breathing of an officer whose authority was being directly challenged in front of the very crowd he was used to suppressing. In the distance, behind the white-painted wooden fence, Wallace Trowbridge stood with his arms crossed, a smug smirk plastered across his face. He nodded in deep satisfaction, watching white authority enforce the exact order he desired. On the altar, Zoraida remained perfectly still. Her dark eyes tracked every micro-movement of Carver's hand on his weapon. No one in this garden, least of all the power-drunk cop, knew that the woman in the pristine white dress was not just a bride. She was the living embodiment of the supreme law he was using as a weapon to trample them. Zoraida slowly tightened her grip on her bouquet, her fingers sending a silent, invisible signal. Hidden in the periphery, behind her back, her cousin Marcus had quietly stepped away a few minutes earlier. His phone was out, the screen glowing, the camera lens fixed steadily with a blinking red light. It was recording every frame, every slur, every arrogant glance of the injustice unfolding. And Carver, blinded by the intoxication of his own arrogance, had absolutely no idea that the trial of his life had just begun rolling tape. The atmosphere in the garden was as taut as a rope stretched across a chasm, waiting for a single tug to snap. Officer Carver ignored Gideon's warning. To a man accustomed to using a badge to cover his own narrow-mindedness, the Black Colonel's calm and iron discipline wasn't a legal reminder. It was the ultimate insult to his ego. He swatted away Gideon's outstretched arm and marched toward the front row. His target was Gideon's main grandmother, an 84-year-old woman trembling as she clutched her beaded purse to her chest. "Old lady, give me your ID. Right now!" Carver barked right in her face, his massive hand snatching at the hymnal she held up as a shield. "Enough!" Solomon Hastings stepped forward, wedging himself between the officer and the elderly woman. The 70-year-old man's straight back formed an impenetrable shield. There was no fear in Solomon's eyes, only the righteous indignation of a homeowner watching his property and family being trampled. "Officer, I have made myself very clear. This is my house. My guests are under no obligation to show you their identification when they have broken no laws. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. You have no warrant, no probable cause. What you are doing is not law enforcement. It's harassment." Solomon's clear, steely words hit Carver like a bucket of ice water. He hadn't expected an old black man to use the Constitution to school him in broad daylight. Carver's face turned crimson, veins bulging at his temples. He jabbed his finger into Solomon's chest, pressing so hard it crushed the white rose pinned to his lapel. "You're harboring a mob capable of starting a riot. Defy me one more time, and I'll throw you in the back of my cruiser for obstructing an officer." In the distance, behind the wooden fence, Wallace Trowbridge took a sip of a fresh beer from his fridge, a sinister smirk creeping onto his lips. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to see these proud people stripped of their elegant veneer, pushed until they had to bow to white authority. Wallace nodded, silently cheering on the enraged cop, but neither Wallace nor Carver knew that every word, every vile action was being locked into a digital frame. In a blind spot behind the altar, Marcus, Zoraida's 25-year-old cousin, had quietly stepped back the moment Carver kicked open the iron gate. Growing up in a society where skin color could be a death sentence, Marcus knew all too well that the only weapon that could protect them right now wasn't a fist, but the truth. He pulled out his smartphone, swiped the screen, and hit record. The red flash blinked steadily. The camera lens focused perfectly. Marcus's hand shook slightly at first from pure rage, but he forced himself to breathe deeply, holding the frame absolutely steady. He didn't say a word, didn't intervene. He simply performed his duty as an invisible digital witness. Marcus's frame panned across the panicked faces of the guests, across Carver's aggression, across the metal nameplate pinned to his chest, and finally rested on Zoraida. Zoraida still stood motionless at the altar, her ivory silk gown contrasting sharply with the chaotic scene. Her icy gaze swept over the officer's shoulder and met Marcus's phone lens. For a tenth of a second, the cousins locked eyes. There was no panicked plea for help. Zoraida gave a faint nod, a nod so subtle no one else noticed, but it carried an ironclad command. "Don't stop. Record every second of it." Down in the aisles, the situation had crossed the point of no return. Seeing Solomon pushed back, Gideon could no longer hold his temper. The colonel took a long stride and swatted Carver's pointing arm away from his father-in-law's chest. The strike wasn't overly forceful, but it carried the decisive weight of an elite soldier. "Get your hands off him," Gideon growled, his pitch dropping to a dangerous low. "You have exceeded your authority, officer. You are trespassing, assaulting a civilian, and abusing your power. I demand you leave this property immediately, or we will take you and your department to federal court." The direct challenge from a towering black man standing in military dress uniform with a chest full of medals shattered Carver's last ounce of reason. He didn't see a military hero. He only saw a man daring to stand taller than him. "Are you threatening me?" Carver roared, his thuggish nature entirely overriding his uniform. Instantly, Carver reached behind his duty belt and yanked out his cold steel handcuffs. Officer Delaney, standing behind him, gasped and took a half step forward to intervene. "Carver, stop! He's unarmed!" But Carver had completely lost control. He lunged, grabbing Gideon's shoulder. Using his entire body weight to violently spin the colonel around, Gideon was taller, stronger, and possessed enough close-quarters combat training to put Carver on the ground in 3 seconds. The muscles in his shoulders tensed, his combat reflexes screaming to be unleashed. But Gideon knew that the moment he raised a hand to resist, Carver would have the excuse he needed to draw the Glock at his hip, and blood would be spilled on his wedding day. Fighting back against a white cop for a black man was tantamount to suicide. So, the United States Army colonel chose physical submission to preserve his ultimate dignity. He didn't fight back. He relaxed his arms, allowing Carver to roughly twist his arm behind his back. Click, click! The locking mechanism of the handcuffs echoed coldly, dryly, tearing through the hearts of the 80 guests. Carver tightened the cuffs so harshly that the steel rings bit deep into Gideon's wrists, cutting through the fabric of his uniform and leaving harsh red welts. He drove his knee hard into Gideon's back, shoving him forward, turning a decorated soldier into a criminal at his own wedding. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer and obstruction of justice," Carver panted, spitting through his teeth, loudly citing baseless charges. He lifted his head, glaring at the stunned crowd, his eyes practically screaming, "Look, this is what happens to those who dare defy my authority." A choked sob echoed from the back row. The 84-year-old grandmother covered her face, weeping. Men clenched their jaws, their fists vibrating with rage hidden inside their pockets. Absolute helplessness blanketed the garden. Behind the fence, Wallace Trowbridge could not hide his excitement. He laughed out loud, the cackle of a petty man relishing his triumph. He raised his beer can as if celebrating a grand victory, utterly satisfied to see this great black man handcuffed and humiliated. But in the shadows, Marcus's phone continued to blink its steady red light. The camera lens had captured every single detail. It captured Carver's lies, it captured the violent arm twist, it captured the click of the handcuffs, it even captured the cruel smile of Wallace Trowbridge from across the fence. It had all become ironclad evidence, permanently indelible. Zoraida still stood there, her wedding dress fluttering lightly in the breeze. The corner of her eye twitched slightly when she heard the cuffs tighten around the wrists of the man she loved. But her face remained as cold as ice. Her calmness was not resignation. It was the stillness of a volcano right before it erupts. The enemy had made their move. Now, it was her turn. As the click of the handcuffs echoed, the entire garden sank into a deathly stillness. It was not the silence of peace, but the suffocating vacuum that descends just before a hurricane makes landfall. Gideon Mercer, the colonel who had commanded hundreds of soldiers through hails of gunfire, now knelt on one knee in his own backyard, his arms twisted behind his back. The cold steel bit deep into his flesh. But he did not break. He raised his eyes, looking straight toward the altar where Zoraida stood. There was no plea for help in the soldier's eyes, only a silent message. "I can take this. Do what you have to do." Officer Carver stood behind Gideon, his chest heaving with the breath of a man intoxicated by a power trip. He swept his arrogant gaze across the rows of seats, silently declaring to the 80 black guests, "Here, under his gun and his badge, there are no exceptions. No military rank, no expensive suit can protect them from his authority." But Carver had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten about the bride. Zoraida Hastings began to move. Her movement did not create the rustle of panic. There were no screams, no hands desperately clutching faces. Every step the bride took down from the rose-strewn wooden platform was slow, rhythmic, and carried an invisible weight that crushed the very air in the space. The ivory silk gown glided across the grass. Zoraida's face, as if carved from an eternal block of ice, revealed absolutely no emotion, no outrage, no fear. It was the face of a person preparing to hand down a sentence. She stepped over the crushed petals, past the trembling elderly pastor, and stopped exactly 3 paces from the tips of Officer Carver's boots. Carver narrowed his eyes slightly. Zoraida's absolute stillness unsettled him. He was used to black women screaming, crying, or lunging to claw at him when their men were arrested. reactions he could easily use as an excuse to charge them with being hysterical or assaulting an officer. But the woman before him stood perfectly straight, her deep dark eyes piercing right through his mirrored sunglasses, looking directly into the weakest, most insecure part of his soul. "Release him," Zoraida spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, nor was it raised, but it carried a strange frequency, the kind of sound that usually only echoed in the oak-paneled chambers of a federal courthouse, where a single word could dictate a person's life and liberty. Carver scoffed, resting one hand on his hip, deliberately pressing his knee harder into Gideon's back to project force. "Listen here, lady. You better stand quietly right there if you don't want your wedding day to end in a holding cell. Your husband just committed obstruction of justice. He's under arrest. He committed no crime," Zoraida replied instantly, the cadence of her words steady, sharp as a scalpel. "Officer, you are standing on private property. You do not have a warrant from a judge. You have no probable cause to make an arrest. Your demand for identification from guests at a private event is a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures." Carver hesitated for half a second. The vocabulary pouring from this woman's mouth was too technical, too fluent. But the ego of an abuser of power did not allow him to back down. He spat onto the grass. "Don't throw your little law dictionary at me. We got a 911 dispatch reporting an armed riot. That is my probable cause." "Wrong," Zoraida cut him off, denying him the chance to regain the upper hand. "An unverified anonymous call does not automatically constitute probable cause, especially when the scene you observe with your naked eye, a quiet wedding, guests in seats, no weapons, no violence, completely contradicts the report. According to Supreme Court precedent, when the scene negates the reliability of the informant, your authority to enforce coercive action immediately terminates." Zoraida took another step forward. The distance was now only 2 paces. Her shadow fell long across the officer's chest. "You have engaged in false imprisonment. You have used excessive force against a citizen who offered zero resistance, and you are abusing your power under the color of law to deprive him of his civil liberties. Every single action you have taken in the last 5 minutes is a state and federal felony." The garden was so quiet one could hear the wind whistling through the oak leaves. The guests held their breath. Officer Delaney, standing behind Carver, began to turn pale. She realized this woman in a wedding dress wasn't just spewing empty threats. Every statute, every precedent, every legal term was chillingly accurate, but Carver, whose ignorance was nurtured by his prejudice, chose the reaction of an inferior man backed into a corner. He burst out laughing, a crude, mocking guffaw that echoed across the garden. "Ha ha ha! Oh my God! Listen to this chick." Carver turned to Delaney, jerking his chin in mockery, but Delaney didn't laugh back. He turned back to Zoraida, his eyes dripping with contempt. "Where do you think you are? Watched too many lawyer shows on TV and memorized a few lines to scare me? You think that theoretical garbage is going to save you and your criminal husband out here in the real world?" He took one hand off Gideon's back, pulled a second set of handcuffs from his belt, and dangled them right in front of Zoraida's face. The clinking of the metal was sickening. "Let me tell you what the rules are out here," Carver growled, leaning his hostile face close to Zoraida's, radiating a violent stench. "I decide the law. I say it's an illegal gathering, it's illegal. I say it's resisting, it's resisting. You better step back or I'll slap these cuffs on both your wrists. Let's see if your little memorized laws can pick this lock when you're thrown in the back of my cruiser." Across the fence, Wallace Trowbridge was so thrilled he almost clapped. He chuckled in his throat. "That's right, cuff that arrogant bitch too. Show them what order looks like," Wallace thought, unable to peel his eyes from the captivating play. Faced with the direct threat and the steel cuffs swinging before her, Zoraida Hastings did not retreat. She didn't blink. She didn't react to his humiliation. To her, Carver was no longer a threat. He was merely a specimen digging his own grave beneath the magnifying glass of the law. She slowly turned her back on Carver. That action, completely turning one's back and ignoring an officer brandishing handcuffs, was the ultimate display of disdain. It entirely stripped away the power Carver was trying to establish. "Hey, where are you going? I didn't give you permission to turn around." Carver roared, gripping the cuffs tightly. Zoraida ignored him. She took measured strides toward the small table set beside the altar. She opened her satin clutch and pulled out a smartphone. Her slender fingers glided swiftly across the screen. She didn't dial 911. She didn't call a lawyer. In her position, those steps were redundant. She tapped a contact saved in her emergency speed dial. She turned on the speakerphone. Each ring echoed clearly in the thick atmosphere of the garden. Ring. After just the second ring, the line picked up. A deep, resonant, and highly authoritative male voice answered. Arthur speaking. It was the voice of Arthur Garrison, chief of the Savannah Police Department, a man renowned for his strictness and the head of the city's entire law enforcement apparatus. Delaney instantly recognized the voice of her supreme commander. The color drained from her face, leaving it ash white. Zoraida held the phone in front of her, her tone shifting. Gone were the lengthy legal explanations. Gone was the pushback. Her voice was now the icy chill of a superior issuing an order, Arthur. This is Zoraida Hastings. No title, no long introduction. Just a name. The man on the other end paused for a beat. Chief Garrison's previously relaxed tone vanished, replaced instantly by absolute deference. Zoraida? What's going on? Isn't today your wedding day? It is, Zoraida replied, her dark eyes darting over the phone screen to lock directly onto Officer Carver's rapidly stiffening face. But currently, one of your officers is trespassing in my backyard at 442 Oak Street. He has just handcuffed my groom. No warrant, no probable cause. He trampled my family's property, demanded ID from 80 innocent guests, and threatened to put me in cuffs because I recited the Fourth Amendment to him. The silence on the other end of the line was terrifying. It wasn't the silence of someone at a loss for words. It was the silence of a bomb that had just been armed. I need you at this scene. Immediately. Zoraida concluded with an order that left no room for refusal. 10 minutes. I will be there personally. Zoraida, I am so incredibly sorry. Just hold the scene. Garrison's voice was so urgent it cracked. Click, Zoraida ended the call. She slipped the phone back into her clutch. The garden plunged back into silence, but the power dynamic in the air had completely flipped. Officer Carver stood rooted to the spot. The handcuffs still dangled from his hand, but his arm had begun to tremble. He wasn't blind. He knew who Arthur was. Any cop in Savannah knew that Chief Garrison's personal cell phone number wasn't something a common civilian could just dial up. And the way Garrison responded, the groveling, the panic, the absolute respect was reserved only for figures on a level Carver could never hope to touch. He looked at Zoraida. The mocking, contemptuous glare from moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by sheer panic. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. He tried to swallow, but his throat was bone dry. Who the hell is this woman? The question echoed in Carver's mind, hammering against his skull. She's just a black bride, right? How can she call the chief of police directly? Why was he so terrified? Behind Carver, Officer Delaney backed up 2 steps. Her hand had dropped completely away from her weapon belt. The look Delaney gave Carver was no longer the timid apprehension of a subordinate. It was the look one gives a dead man. 30 feet away, behind the wooden fence, Wallace Trowbridge had also stopped laughing. The beer can slip from his sweaty fingers, landing with a dull thud on the grass. He couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he heard the name Arthur, and he saw the collapse on the aggressive cop's face. Instinct told Wallace that the play he had so painstakingly orchestrated had just derailed disastrously. Zoraida stepped back to her original position, exactly 3 paces from Carver. She crossed her arms. Under the evening light, her white silk gown now looked exactly like a judicial robe draped over her shoulders. She stared unblinkingly at Carver. Panic began to corrode the officer. He shifted his eyes to the handcuffed Gideon, then back to Zoraida, his mouth opening as if to spout some excuse, to salvage some fragment of his shattering authority. But his throat seized up. Zoraida didn't curse at him. She didn't need to return his threats. She simply stood there, radiating the stillness of absolute power, waiting for the sentence to be carried out. Now, Zoraida's voice broke the silence, each word dropping like a sledgehammer. We are going to wait for your chief of police to get here and explain to me whether the law you just decided upon is greater than the Constitution of this country. 10 minutes, in ordinary moments, 10 minutes is just the blink of an eye. But in the Hastings backyard right now, those 10 minutes stretched into a century of judgment. The air grew thick, so suffocating and still that the rustle of Officer Carver's uniform every time he shifted, his weight sounded as loud as thunder. Carver still stood there, right behind Gideon. His hand rested lightly on the handcuffed colonel's shoulder, but the aggressive, superior force from earlier had completely evaporated. His palms sweated cold and slippery. He swallowed repeatedly, his eyes darting frantically from Zoraida to his pale partner Delaney, and then out toward the street. He was desperately trying to formulate a reason, a scenario in his head to reassure himself that this black woman in a wedding dress was just playing mind games, that she just happened to know the chief's name, that everything was still under his control, but deep down, the survival instinct of a bully told Carver the truth. He had made a mistake from which there was no turning back. Exactly 10 minutes after the call, the roar of a V8 engine tore through the silence. A glossy black Chevrolet Tahoe SUV, sirens off but grille lights flashing furiously, took a hard turn onto Oak Street and hurtled straight toward the Hastings gate. The vehicle braked hard, tires smoking, stopping mere inches from Carver's patrol car. The door swung open. Police Chief Arthur Garrison stepped out. He wasn't in full uniform. Garrison wore a plain dress shirt and trousers. His tie loosened, a clear sign he had dropped everything on his weekend off and sped here himself. The face of Savannah's top law enforcement official was dark with fury, etched with deep lines of rage and sheer panic. Garrison took long, powerful strides, kicking the iron gate completely open, just as Carver had done earlier. His eyes swept over the scene. A magnificent garden, elegantly dressed guests sitting in stunned silence. A young man pointing a smartphone camera directly at him. A decorated U.S. Army colonel kneeling handcuffed on the grass, and Zoraida Hastings standing tall, regal in her ivory wedding gown. "Chief," Carver stammered, stepping forward to intercept and spin the narrative in his favor. He intended to mention the hostile suspects and the emergency dispatch. "Shut your mouth," Garrison roared, his voice echoing like a gunshot. He didn't even spare Carver a single glance. He marched past his subordinate as if he were an invisible pile of garbage. Heading straight for the altar, when he stood before Zoraida, the most powerful police official in Savannah, the man who held the city's security and political life in his hands, came to a sudden halt. He clicked his heels together, pulled off his sunglasses, and bowed deeply in absolute deference. "Federal Judge Hastings, I am incredibly sorry for allowing this disgrace to happen on your property." Federal Judge Hastings, those 4 words rang out sharp and clear, piercing the eardrums of everyone present. The entire garden seemingly exploded in silence. The guests' jaws dropped, their eyes wide as they stared at the bride. The elderly pastor hugged his Bible tightly to his chest, tears of sheer shock and pride welling in his eyes. But the most horrific reaction belonged to Officer Carver. When the phrase "federal judge" escaped his supreme commander's mouth, Carver's knees gave way. The blood drained from his face instantly, leaving his skin the ashen gray of a corpse. He stumbled back a step, nearly tripping over the edge of the wooden platform. The world around him collapsed, shattering into jagged shards of glass that pierced directly into his brain. A federal judge. The woman he had just mocked for reading from a law dictionary, the woman he had just threatened to throw in the back of a cruiser, was one of the most powerful adjudicators in the judicial system of the United States. Federal courts were where civil rights violations and police abuse cases were tried. In other words, Zoraida Hastings was the highest authority capable of signing the order to throw him in federal prison. And he had just handcuffed her groom on their wedding day. Zoraida did not respond to Garrison's apology right away. She maintained a terrifying silence, her dark eyes looking down at the chief, then slowly shifting to Carver. "You have 10 seconds to release my husband, Arthur," Zoraida said, her tone as sharp as a razor. Garrison snapped upright and whirled toward Delaney, who was standing frozen in terror. "Delaney, keys!" "Uncuff Colonel Mercer right now," Garrison barked. Officer Delaney jumped. She frantically fumbled at her dirty belt, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her keys in the grass. She sprinted over to Gideon and dropped to her knees. The frantic clicking of metal echoed in the quiet yard. Click. The handcuffs sprang open. "I'm sorry, I'm so sincerely sorry," Colonel Delaney stammered, tears of fear and shame spilling down her cheeks. She knew that standing by and watching her partner abuse his power without intervening had made her an accomplice. Gideon Mercer stood up slowly. He didn't even look at Delaney. The colonel brought his hands up, gently rubbing the harsh, bleeding red welts etched into his strong wrists. He turned to look at Zoraida. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Zoraida reached out, gently pressing her soft palm against Gideon's cheek. The icy demeanor of the judge vanished, replaced by the tender ache of a wife. Gideon covered her hand with his and gave a small nod. "I'm all right." Once Gideon was safe, the true wrath of the law began to descend. Garrison pivoted, marching straight toward Carver. The distance between the chief and the officer closed so tight that Carver could feel the heat of his commander's fury. "Chief, sir, let me explain," Carver stuttered, raising his hands weakly. "There was a 911 call. They reported weapons. I was just following procedure to secure the Procedure?" Garrison interrupted, his voice low but carrying the destructive force of a bomb. "What procedure allows you to storm onto private property without a warrant? What procedure teaches you to demand IDs from citizens attending a wedding? What procedure allows you to handcuff a compliant United States Army colonel right in front of his wife, who happens to be a sitting federal judge?" I didn't know who the judge was," Carver pleaded, but his excuse only exposed his rotten core. "You didn't need to know who she was." Zoraida's voice suddenly cut through his pathetic defense. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Compliance with the Constitution does not depend on whether the person standing before you is a federal judge or a poor citizen. You are not permitted to violate anyone's civil rights, regardless of their status. You're not sorry right now because you realize you broke the law. You're sorry because you realized you picked the wrong prey." Every word Zoraida spoke was a nail driven into the coffin of Carver's career. He hung his head, his entire body trembling like a dead leaf in a storm. "Officer Troy Carver," Garrison declared, his volume loud enough for Marcus's camera to catch every syllable. "You have grossly violated departmental policy, civil rights, and the use of force protocols. You are suspended immediately without pay, pending an internal affairs and FBI investigation. Hand over your weapon and your badge. Right here, right now." The sentence was passed. There was no room for leniency, no protection from the police union. Carver slowly reached up to his chest. His trembling fingers unpinned the tin badge. He handed it to Garrison. Then he unholstered his Glock, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and surrendered it all. In just a few minutes, the arrogant shell of power he had used to terrorize black people was stripped entirely away. Without his gun and his badge, Carver was now nothing more than a cowardly man who had broken the law and was heading for prison. "Delaney," Garrison ordered, "get him to the car. You are also suspended pending investigation for failure to intervene. Get off this property before I put you both in cuffs myself." Delaney kept her head down, grabbing Carver by the arm and pulling him away. The two officers trudged out the gate, a picture of absolute disgrace. But the play wasn't over yet. In the shadows behind the wooden fence, Wallace Trowbridge was hyperventilating. His previously flushed face was ghost white, the beer from his dropkin soaked into the soil. He had just witnessed the complete destruction of an armed police officer with just a few words from the black woman next door. "Federal judge." Wallace's brain repeated the phrase in a loop of sheer panic. He realized he had messed with the wrong people. He had made a false 911 report to frame a federal judge and an Army colonel. That charge was enough to land him in prison and bankrupt him with fines. His cowardly instincts taking over, Wallace took a cautious step back, intending to turn and sprint into his house, lock the doors, and pretend he had never been involved. "We are not done." Zoraida's icy voice rang out. She turned, her dark eyes piercing through the gaps in the fence, locking dead onto Wallace's retreating back. She raised her arm and pointed directly at the neighbor. Marcus instantly shifted his phone's angle, zooming the lens right onto Wallace's panicked face. "Arthur," Zoraida said, never taking her eyes off her enemy. "The anonymous 911 call reporting an armed riot was made from that house. The man behind that fence, Wallace Trowbridge, has continuously harassed my family with false allegations for the past 6 years. This time, his actions directly led to the physical assault of my husband." Garrison scowled, whipping his head to glare at Wallace. The chief marched right up to the fence, his imposing presence completely overpowering the neighbor. "Wallace Trowbridge," Garrison shouted, his voice echoing against Wallace's windows. "You think you can weaponize my police force to satisfy your cheap bigotry? Filing a false report, wasting emergency resources, and providing misinformation that led to violence. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp, my detectives will be knocking on your door with an arrest warrant. Don't even think about running." Wallace Trowbridge shook violently, his knees knocking together. He opened his mouth to deny it, but when he saw Marcus's phone pointed at him with the red recording light glaring, his throat seized. He knew his life was over. No lawyer could save him from video evidence and a direct accusation from a federal judge. Wallace turned and bolted into his house, the slam of his wooden door sounding exactly like the closing of a casket on his own life. Outside, the two patrol cars quietly started their engines. No lights, no sirens, and shamefully backed out of Oak Street, vanishing from sight. Chief Garrison gave one final respectful nod to Zoraida and Gideon before climbing into his black SUV and driving off, returning the rightful piece to the garden. As the last vehicle disappeared, silence once again blanketed the Hastings estate. But this time, it wasn't the suffocating silence of fear. It was the quiet relief of liberation. 1 second, 2 seconds, then 3 seconds passed. From the third row, the 84-year-old grandmother, the very woman Carver had yelled at, slowly stood up. She raised her wrinkled, trembling hands and began to clap. A slow, steady, powerful rhythm. Immediately, her granddaughter stood up and joined her. Then Solomon Hastings. Then all 80 guests present in the garden. The applause erupted like thunder, shattering the ominous atmosphere, crushing the prejudice and oppression that had just polluted the air. It wasn't just an applause to congratulate the bride and groom. It was a standing ovation for resilience, for dignity, and for justice executed in the most brilliant way possible. Zoraida looked down at her loved ones, the corners of her eyes shimmering with crystal-clear tears for the first time that day. She turned to Gideon. The colonel smiled, his eyes radiating pure happiness, despite the bruised welts on his wrists. He reached out, gently taking her hand. Pastor Solomon spoke up, the gentle smile returning to the old father's face. He signaled the string quartet to resume. The violin swelled once more, purer and more melodious than ever. "We missed the vows. Let's continue." The elderly pastor wiped the tears from his cheeks, reopened his Bible, and cleared his throat with fierce pride. "Zoraida Hastings," Gideon continued, his voice husky as he looked deep into his wife's eyes, "you are the beacon of truth. You are the steadfastness I've always searched for. Today and forevermore, I am yours." Zoraida squeezed his hand, her warm, proud voice rising to echo across the garden. "Gideon Mercer, no matter how cruel the world outside may be, no matter how hard the darkness tries to obscure the truth, I promise to always use every ounce of strength I possess to stand by you, protect you, and love you. I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor declared boldly. "You may kiss the bride." Gideon leaned down, pulling Zoraida into a deep, passionate kiss amidst the cheers, whistles, and happy tears of the entire crowd. The little flower girl in the lemon yellow dress threw her rose petals high into the air once more. Beneath the shadow of the great oak tree, love, truth, and justice intertwined, forging an unbreakable ending. And the video on Marcus's phone was saved. An eternal testament that true power does not reside in handcuffs or the barrel of a gun, but in the unwavering resolve to never bow down to evil. That night, while Zoraida and Gideon soaked in the hard-won peace of their wedding night, leaving the chaos of the long day behind, a high-magnitude earthquake was officially triggered across cyberspace. Sitting in the dim light of his living room, Marcus stared at his phone screen. The video was exactly 11 minutes and 42 seconds long. He didn't cut a single frame, didn't add any filters, and didn't lay any background music over it. He wanted the world to see the raw, unfiltered truth, exactly as it had unfolded beneath the shade of the old oak tree. He typed out a brief, piercing caption: "When the enforcer of the law becomes its destroyer, Savannah, Georgia." Marcus hit post. The social media algorithm didn't need more than 10 minutes to catch the heat of the footage. What started as a few hundred shares from friends multiplied into the thousands, then tens of thousands within 2 hours. By the next morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, the video had crossed 10 million views and was growing exponentially. The contrast between the heroes and the villain was displayed with shocking clarity. On one side, the battle-tested Army colonel, his chest gleaming with medals proving his loyalty and sacrifice for his country, kneeling with his hands cuffed behind his back. On the other side, the red-faced white cop, smirking arrogantly as he spewed prejudiced insults. And in the middle, silent but carrying the weight of a mountain, stood the woman in the white wedding dress, a federal judge, coldly using the United States Constitution to terminate the abuser's career. National news outlets immediately seized the story. From CNN to Fox News to the New York Times, front pages were dominated by explosive headlines. Decorated Army colonel handcuffed at his own wedding, shocking abuse of power in Savannah, and when a cop crosses a federal judge, the sentence begins at the altar. Public outrage surged like a tsunami. The fury didn't just come from the black community. It poured in from every demographic, every social class, taxpayers who had once believed in the integrity of the badge. Millions of furious comments demanded justice. Thousands of calls flooded the hotlines of Savannah City Hall and police department, crashing their switchboards. And on the internet, no secret remains hidden. Less than 12 hours after the video went live, netizens had unearthed everything about Officer Troy Carver. His home address, his private social media accounts, his service record, and even his family photos were plastered across the web. From a man who once smugly wielded power in a uniform, Carver had instantly become the nation's newest poster boy for systemic racism and police brutality. Carver's small suburban home was plunged into darkness. The blinds were drawn tight. He sat huddled on his living room sofa, his eyes bloodshot. Staring blankly at the television screen that looped the moment, he cowardly surrendered his badge. His phone, tossed into the corner of the room, vibrated relentlessly with death threats and curses from strangers. But the cruelest punishment wasn't the cyber attack. It was the real-world fallout. That afternoon, when Carver's wife went to the local grocery store, she was met with cold, disgusted glares from neighbors who used to greet her warmly. The cashier refused to smile. Other parents at their child's school whispered and pointed as the kid walked by. Carver's collapsed career had dragged his entire family into a swamp of disgrace. He was locked inside his own home, a prisoner of public opinion, long before he ever stepped foot in a courtroom. The crushing pressure from the media and the public accelerated the legal process to an unprecedented speed. There were no prolonged internal investigations, no paid administrative leave pending review. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, immediately took over the case under the Civil Rights Act, Title 18 U.S.C., Section 202, deprivation of rights under color of law. Troy Carver's trial was swift and brutal. The testimony of Officer Delaney, who chose to stand on the side of truth to redeem herself, combined with Marcus's 11-minute unedited video, provided irrefutable evidence. No defense attorney in the country could whitewash the violent arm twist, the steel handcuffs, and the deeply prejudiced threats. On the day of his sentencing, Carver stood before the bench. His proud police uniform had been replaced by a bright orange jumpsuit. He hung his head, his shoulders shaking as the presiding judge struck the gavel. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. The doors of federal prison swung open, welcoming him with a 5-year sentence without the possibility of parole. The man who had used handcuffs to strip away the freedom and dignity of others would now spend years feeling that cold metal biting into his own wrists. Meanwhile, at 442 Oak Street, another reckoning was quietly taking place. Wallace Trowbridge, the man behind the curtain, the one who ignited the entire ordeal with a fake 911 call, did not face federal prison like Carver, but his punishment was devastating in a different way. Zoraida Hastings' elite team of attorneys filed a massive 100-page civil lawsuit aimed squarely at Wallace. The charges: intentional infliction of emotional distress, systematic harassment, and abuse of the emergency dispatch system resulting in physical assault. Wallace's history of 23 baseless HOA and police complaints over the past 6 years was dragged into the light, serving as ironclad proof of a malicious harassment campaign fueled by racial animus. The civil trial crushed Wallace. The jury ordered him to pay a staggering sum in punitive damages to the Hastings family. His savings, his retirement funds, and the equity in his home were frozen to satisfy the judgment. He was utterly bankrupted, yet the heaviest punishment came from the very neighborhood he had delusionally believed he owned. The truth about his fake 911 call was public. His white neighbors, the people Wallace mistakenly thought would rally behind him, turned their backs on him entirely. No one wanted to be associated with a disgraced racist despised by the whole country. They didn't yell at him. They did something far worse. They treated him as if he didn't exist. The morning nods vanished. No one invited him to weekend barbecues. No one brought over his misdelivered mail. A few months after the wedding, on a foggy, damp morning, a beat-up moving truck parked in front of Trowbridge's house. A sold sign was driven deep into the dying grass of his front lawn. Wallace silently carried cardboard boxes to the truck. The 55-year-old man looked haggard, aged beyond his years, his back hunched under the crushing weight of defeat and humiliation. Through the slits of the surrounding blinds, neighbors quietly watched him pack. Not a single person stepped out to say goodbye. Wallace climbed into the cab and started the engine. The moving truck rolled out of Oak Street, leaving behind a permanent loser, exiled from the very place he had tried to purge others from. His property had just been sold to a young Asian American family that winter at the United States District Court. Pale sunlight pierced through the large stained glass windows, casting soft golden streaks across the polished oak floor. The heavy wooden door behind the bench slowly swung open. Zoraida Hastings entered. Gone was the radiant, elegant ivory silk gown of her wedding day. Today, she was draped in the pitch-black robe of a federal judge. Every step she took retained that same steady, rhythmic, and commanding presence, the exact demeanor that had reduced an abusive cop to trembling mess. The entire courtroom rose in unison. Absolute reverence blanketed every corner of the room. Zoraida ascended to the highest seat. She swept her gaze across the room. There was no place for cheap prejudice here, no room for impulsive emotions or meaningless shouting. Here there was only the truth and the law. She sat down. Her dark eyes, calm as a lake before a storm yet sharp as a drawn sword, scanned the open case file before her. A faint, razor-thin smile graced the corners of her lips. She raised the wooden gavel high, then brought it down hard against the brass block. Bang, the sharp, authoritative crack echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the oak walls, carrying a message that required no translation. True power is not using violence to force others to their knees. True power is not screaming to prove you are right. Zoraida's power, and the sharpest weapon of the oppressed, is the stillness of intellect. It is knowing the enemy's rules inside and out, and possessing the ability to use the blinding light of truth, whether through the lens of the law or the lens of a smartphone, to burn away the darkest corners of injustice. Justice sometimes does not need to raise its voice. It only needs to show up, and the darkness will have no choice but to retreat. The story of the Hastings family comes to a close, but its echo continues to resonate in the minds of us all. Silent Justice is not just a script about evil paying the price. It carries a profound and poignant message about modern society. Zoraida Hastings won. She used her very composure, intellect, and position as a federal judge to turn the tables, shattering the arrogance of an abusive system. But behind the halo of justice served, there is a thorny question we cannot avoid. What would have happened if Zoraida were not a federal judge? What if she were just an ordinary woman, without the chief of police's phone number, and without an intimate knowledge of the Fourth Amendment? And what would have happened if Marcus hadn't stepped back to turn on his phone's camera? The answer is terrifying. Without those elements, Gideon might have become the next victim of police brutality. And Wallace Trowbridge would have continued standing behind the fence, smiling smugly as evil prevailed. The core message of this story is, truth and justice need courageous witnesses. The most powerful weapon against oppression is not a fist, but the knowledge of one's own rights, the stillness of reason in the face of provocation, and the courage to record the truth. Any one of us can become a Marcus Grana witness who refuses to turn a blind eye to injustice. Social media, when used correctly, is a court of conscience where no badge or power can bend the truth. If this story touched your emotions, if it made you furious at evil and brought you to tears over the resilience of those protecting justice, do not keep it to yourself. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you were one of the guests sitting at that wedding, what would you have done? Don't forget to hit the like button on this video to spread this powerful message to more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on the dramatic, meaningful, and deeply emotional stories in our upcoming videos. Thank you for listening. Always keep a cool head and a warm heart and never bow down to injustice. See you next story.